Hi. Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about corruption. And what I want to note about this topic is that it was handed to me by Piotr. I'm assuming you know who Piotr is. And I think that's very funny because, of course, Bulgarians corrupt, haha. Balkans is the worst place of Europe, haha. Yes, that was a mandatory introduction to this session. But otherwise, if you don't know me, hi, I'm Velina. As Martin already said, I have quite a bit of experience in Europe. I have won the European Debating Championship, and I have also been the chief adjudicator of the last version. So I have some expertise in this debating thing. But how this session is going to go is actually, I think I'm going to be much more knowledge heavy on corruption. And at the end of the session, I am actually going to talk a little bit more about how this can get implemented within debating, because I think with corruption is much more important to understand the process of it rather than how exactly to work it within your analysis in debating, because I think it's somewhat intuitive. I think in order to make a corruption case within an argument believable, you need to kind of know what you're going for. You also need to be able to illustrate it quite well, especially with people that don't have an intuition about how corruption works as to why it works on such a massive scale as it does right now. And what are the implications for people? Because I think there are general misconceptions about corruption, that it always happens only in the developing world, in the global south, that it is only about money, so embezzlement, bribes, whatever, and that it's relatively not that important, e.g., it might trickle down or it doesn't actually affect people all that much. All of those things are wrong, and I'm going to explain as to why that is the case, and I'm just going to try to give you like a comprehensive view on corruption. Um, a couple more notes before I actually start with the session. The majority of the examples that I'm going to give are going to be from Bulgaria because of two reasons. The first one is obviously I am Bulgarian, and so it's much easier for me to brief you on examples that I know of, but they're going to be examples that are not Bulgarian, that give you a broader spectrum of things to look out in corruption. The second reason why I'm giving you examples from Bulgaria is because Worlds is around the corner. We have less than 3 months left before the start of Worlds, or at least the end of Worlds. And Worlds is in Bulgaria. There is mandatorily going to be a Bulgarian motion / Balkan motion. And I think it's kind of important for you to kind of know what's happening in Bulgaria. So again, as I was handed this topic, surely there is corruption in Bulgaria. I think this makes sense. Feel free to ask me questions during the session, because I'm like on a shared screen. I cannot like look at the Discord chat. You can interrupt me and ask me a question. I will also like give a slot for questions in the end. As Martin said, I will try to fit this within an hour. I will do my best to do it. I think if I do not finish within an hour, I'm going to give you the slides and you can figure it out, just with the purpose of this not being incredibly long. But I tend to like talking, which bad for you, good for me, I guess. But yeah, just this is in general. So what do we mean by corruption? I think the first thing that we need to do when we are talking about corruption is actually define it. So the definition that I found on Google was this dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power. By the way, there was a second addition to this definition, which was often about money. I disagree with this addition that it is often about money. In very many cases, it is not about money, and that is why I only left the dishonest and fraudulent conduct. So the thing to note about this definition, and I'm assuming most of you, while some of you might not be as familiar with debating or haven't gotten to the meat and potatoes of debating, in debating we have this concept that all analysis, all arguments need to be based on two things. The first one is intent, so somebody wants to do something. The second one is capacity or capability, that somebody has the ability to do something. And every argument needs to be based on those two things, because without them, no action happens. You need to have both intent and capacity for an action to happen, because just how the world works. If I want to build an Empire State Building and I really want it, but I don't have the money, obviously this is not going to happen. But also, if I have the money and I don't want to build it, it's also not going to happen. And that is, we have those ideas to balance out of intent and capacity. And here I have noted that this definition of corruption presumes intent. So we presume that there are actors that want to do this honest or fraudulent conduct, and we at the very least, presume that they have knowledge for it and haven't intervened with it. Because if you think about it long enough, okay, it might be just the case that they know that corruption is happening and that they aren't intervening in it. But again, this also has to do with intent. They don't have the intent or the desire to intervene when something wrong is happening. Corruption is very often outside of the law, so it is something that is illegal, but at the same time, it is something that happens, and the more it happens, the more it happens. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle. The more of corruption you have, the more people think it is something acceptable for them to conduct corruption. And in many cases, the more it gets integrated within society, the less people label it as corruption and just like the general day-to-day life of people. But to that, we'll get in a second. I wanted to make a differentiation between corruption and negligence, because negligence is failure to keep a proper care over something. So it does not include intent of any mean. So it doesn't include intent slash desire for you to make sure that somebody is not getting the care that they need. For example, you are removing welfare from a certain person, you're like embezzling the funds for that, although this is not how corruption looks like. But let's say, just for me to be able to explain negligence, this is not the same as you have no information that somebody is not receiving proper care, or you're utterly incompetent, leading to this person not receiving proper care. So negligence does not account for intent. It's rather isolated from intent, and it only happens due to incompetence or lack of information, but in very many instances it is just incompetence. And I want to separate those two ideas, because corruption in very many instances might have the same outcomes as negligence. For example, people are living beneath the poverty line and they are struggling very much. This obviously can happen due to corruption, because there is cyclical fraudulent activity within the country. There is embezzlement of funds and they're not getting redistributed in the proper way. There is not enough of infrastructure building, so some people are receiving proper care. There is not enough of job openings because the government does not conduct itself with integrity, and those jobs go to certain people that have connections as opposed to those that deserve them, and that is why you have a cyclical problem with poverty. This is different than negligence, where the government is just incompetent, and this is the reason as to why people are living beneath the poverty line. So there is a difference. I just wanted to make it a little bit clearer, because I think it's important. Not all bad things happening in the world are due to corruption, some of because of negligence, and I think, yeah, something to keep in mind. But there are very many different types of corruption: bribery, extortion, nepotism, embezzlement, fraud, all types of things. It happens on multiple different levels, so it doesn't happen only from the people that are from the top. So we are talking about country leaders or ministers or mayors. It very often can happen at all structures and all levels of the structures, meaning we can talk about clerks doing corruption, we can talk about managers doing corruptions, we can talk about basic employees doing corruption by, for example, not reporting the proper amount of hours that they have worked, or doing bribes on a daily basis. If, for example, you're a policeman that is on the road checking cars, whether you have proper registration or there is alcohol involved, all of those things. So it can happen on multiple different levels. And it can also be, and this is how I kind of have structured this presentation, it can be on two levels. The first one is bottom up, where corruption happen, where the population kind of requires for corruption to happen, where you are bribing, for example, officials that are above you out of your own free will. You want to get away with something, you want allowance for something. This is why it's bottom up. It starts from the people that are benefiting from this corruption, and then it corrupts the higher levels of the hierarchy. And then there is top down corruption, meaning that corruption happens from this elite class of people, from the government to the population, not necessarily the other way above. And so the first time of corruption, this I didn't mean for this to start, is the bottom up. And I wanted to start with kind of a case study, again, a Bulgarian example. We are starting with them already, on how bottom up corruption can work. So the example here is bribery. And I'm going to play a little video, and then I'm going to explain what is currently happening. This is like from 3rd of October, so a couple of days ago something happened in Bulgaria. So we have those massive floods. You can see them. Oh no, never mind. a lot of things. You can see the video. Like massive floods, things are getting completely wiped out. Multiple people died. And here you cannot even see like the floods are so big that they're like dragging buildings and cars. Um, and this, from the first time you see it, you can be like, oh, floods are happening, climate change, awful thing. The government is probably maybe not as well prepared for it, so that is the reason as to why it's happening. But in reality, this was something that was, there were so many warnings that this might happen. But only because of corruption this actually happened in the first place. What do I mean by this? So this is a resort town in Bulgaria on the seaside that is, both those pictures are the same resort. So it is right on the seaside. You can see it. It has access to the sea. And this is in 2003. You can see how there are not a lot of buildings there. They're kind of on the side. They're not immediately in the center. And you can see how in 2024, all of this is like with so many buildings. All of those are like hotels or Airbnbs and all of those things. Why does that matter? Because here on the 2003 image, in the middle there is a river, and this river goes to the sea, of course. And this, so on the sides of this kind of town in the middle, those are mountains. So every single time that it rains heavily, and especially we are talking autumn and spring, it rains very heavily, all of the water from the mountains flows within the river in the middle, and the river is like the way for the water to join the sea. And this is also why the buildings are kind of on the side and not in the center. What happened is that there was an election of a mayor of this municipality that was very prone to bribes. And some particular Bulgarian businessman decided to build a holiday locational village in particularly this location, and gave a lot of bribes to forego regulations of the structure of those buildings in order to build it there. So it was not legal to build there because of the likelihood of floods happening, because of all of the water that basically every single year goes there. And with climate change, of course, this skyrocketed, and that's why we have those massive, massive floods. But basically every year you have a type of floods there. But also, not only did they, forego all of the regulations to build right in the center of this town, they also forego the regulation and they put the river beneath the town. So the buildings were built over the river, and all of the river went under the town. And you can see how this is a recipe for disaster, right? When a lot of rain falls, and this was like an absurd amount of rain that fell earlier this month, this happens where everything gets incredibly flooded and people die. So here you can see the connection where you have a corrupt government, which is prone to bribery. People have an incentive to bribe the government because they want to build something there, they want to make a shitload of profit there, because again, it's a nice location, it is on the beach, a lot of people want to go there, not only Bulgarians but internationals. It is probably relatively cheap for them to do so. They want to forego those regulations, they pay very hefty bribes. There are not a lot of regulations, or not necessarily regulations, but there aren't checks and balances, so nobody checks whether the regulations have been met, or at least you're paying the bribe every step of the way. So every single time that somebody tells you, oh, there might be a regulatory check, you pay a bribe. They don't check. You're kind of building things even without the knowledge of the municipal government, so the local government. So even a lot of those buildings are unregistered in the first place. But again, because the government doesn't do any checks, ups, and services, because they benefit from it, probably through bribes, this happens. Bottom line is people die. And this we can see all throughout the world. We can also see it in the Turkey-Syria earthquake, a very famous example of this, where it was a very devastating earthquake. We have a death toll of over 50,000 people. This was for the reason, again, that many of the buildings that were built within a region that is very prone to earthquakes, it was not the first earthquake to hit, did not pass the threshold of what the code for buildings was. So you have some governmental standards, especially for those areas. You need to use certain types of concrete. Building needs to be built certain amounts of floors, but all of this was not necessarily the case because companies that were building those types of buildings were very close to Erdogan, and so a lot of them just got the ability to not do this. Either they were paying bribes directly, again, or they were paying bribes to the local government for all of their plans to get certified, and so they have the ability to build those buildings, to sell those buildings. A lot of the checks and services, like there weren't regulatory checks on those buildings, like at all, and no wonder that most of the buildings went down when the earthquake hit, because most of them weren't up to code for the situation that they were in, and so many people died, so many people were displaced. We are talking about 16% of the population of Turkey, and this was all like in a couple of hours because of the earthquake. And this, if we try to extend it, you can probably find examples of this type of bribery where just people that have a profit incentive or have a personal incentive for some type of corruption to happen within the country are able to bribe the government. So it foregoes those types of rules and regulations. So they are able to make this type of profit. You can also see this as the reason for, not necessarily the reason, but the catalyst for the protests that are currently happening in Serbia. I think you're probably heard about them, where we have massive youth-led protests all around the country. In some instances, they reached over 1 million people that were on the street protesting. And the reason for that is because in 2024, it's actually just a year now, a train station, it's not the train station itself, but like outside of the train station, it collapsed because of poor building standards, because the companies that were building it were able to forego those types of regulations. It fell, it killed like 14 people, I think, right on the spot. And this is what sparked Serbian protests, because this is also a problem that has been there perpetually. So bribery can look in multiple ways. So this bottom-up corruption, it is where individuals, companies pay to play, basically, to avoid restrictions and regulations. And it affects all aspects of the government. It affects infrastructure regulations, as I was talking about, buildings, but it also like affects roads. Like in Bulgaria, most of the highways that are classified as highways, if you inspect them, and we have had independent journalists inspect them, they don't classify, like the concrete is not deep enough. Like this is one of the classifications for whether you're a highway or not, because it depends on how much the friction between the tire and the concrete is going to be. And also like the particles in the concrete need to be a certain ratio. This is also not the case in Bulgaria. So it means that cars are allowed to drive with a certain speed that they shouldn't be allowed to drive at, because the friction is different. But because companies have bribed the government to basically build not up to code, because that way they cut costs, they save money. We have a lot of roads that are basically classified as something that is not what they are, which is leading to a lot of car crashes happening. But this can also be about the dams power plant. Again, in Bulgaria, we have a very famous example where a lot of our power plants are producing way too much waste and carbon to emissions, and at the same time are exploiting a shitload of workers, but they're paying the government or paying certain officials or checkers from the government not for this to be something taken into account, not to be prosecuted, and thus it is a perpetual problem where just certain people that have a profit incentive for this are avoiding the governmental regulation. But it can be also regulation about anything. It can be regulation about food, whether the agencies that are checking what are the types of components of food, whether you're using some types of toxic chemicals within the food. Again, in Bulgaria, we had a big revelation 3 years ago that our agency that was checking the safety of our foods was continuously getting bribes for the past 20 years, and there were multiple toxic components in most of the popular foods within Bulgaria, literally poisoning most of the population by daily consumption. It can also be about regulation of medicine. When we received the COVID vaccines in Bulgaria, they needed to be stored in very particular refrigerators, so the validity of the vaccine when you're taking it, it's actually your body is actually able to process it, and it's actually going to be able to protect your immune system or whatever vaccines do. I am not a med student. But what happened in Bulgaria is that we didn't have those refrigerators, or at least the government didn't want to pay for them, or the companies that were executing the vaccines did not. And what happened was that the government just closed their eyes, and a lot of the vaccines that we received were not actually as effective, at the very least. At worst, there is speculation, or at least there are a couple of papers that are saying that they actually can be harmful to people because they were not kept at the standards that they should be kept. It can be about education, whether people are passing classes, whether you need to pay a bribe to the teacher in order to pass a class. This is something that regularly happens within the countryside, where this is the way for you to get out of a bad grade and to graduate high school. And so it can literally be about all stages of government, but also how you interact with private companies at this point in time. It's not only about the government, it's also like you're avoiding any type of lawful responsibility. And talking about that, so it also affects all laws and their implementability. So you can get out of a fine. You can pay the specific policeman that is giving you the fine. A couple of days ago, again in Bulgaria, and I'm sorry, it is just useful examples that you should know about worlds. Robbie Williams, the very famous singer, came to Bulgaria, and the truck that was transporting his equipment was stopped by Bulgarian policemen for check. And they didn't know English, and they wanted a bribe out of the drivers that are on the truck that is with Robbie Williams equipment. They pulled out Google Translate. They, on Google Translate, tried to explain to the truck drivers that they wanted for them to get to get some money. The truck drivers did not have any cash on them, so the police them escorted them to an ATM where they drew money. And they paid the policeman this type of bribe. So it's also about getting out of a fine. Here, by the way, I can put an asterisk and say it's not necessarily that it is bottom up in this way. Like, still people are paying a bribe to the officials, so they are bribing their way out of a fine in one way or another. But this type of bribery can also be considered top down, because it's kind of the policeman is forcing you to pay a bribe to access a service. Maybe another good example of this would be in Bulgaria, sometimes you need to pay a bribe to the doctor for the doctor to examine you if you are in like a very bad condition. If they always like to say, oh, we are very busy, our schedule is completely full, but if you like give them a 20, they'll be like, okay, maybe I'll take you. And in this way, they coerce you into giving a bribe, but it is still, to a certain extent, a bottom-up type of corruption, because it is, in the end, the benefit of the population, or at least singular individuals within the population that are getting this type of benefit from corruptions. But it can also be about the regulation, about the functioning of the government. Here I have a fun example that is not about Bulgaria, and it's not particularly fun. It is a fall of Mosul, which is an Iraqi city. So this happened in 2014, when there was this Iraqi city that on paper was supposed to be guarded by around 36,000 military men from the Iraqi army. And this was on paper, and this is how everybody accounted for the city, the US military as well. And ISIS decided to try to infiltrate the city with the purpose of, there was a prison within the city where some ISIS prisoners were held, and they decided, even if it's a suicide mission, it was very important to them to free those prisoners from the city of Mosul. And they decided to send a relatively small ISIS unit to penetrate Mosul and to try to free those people, even at the cost of this being, a suicide mission, given that 36,000 people are guarding the city. What happened was ISIS was sent this unit, but it was able to basically walk through the whole city of Mosul without being stopped for any checks. They didn't run into any military men. Maybe I lied here. They ran into one unit that was, I think, 6 people that were not particularly well armed. And ISIS basically freed the prisoners with little to no problem. And at this point, when they freed the prisoners, they realized that the city was basically up to be taken from for them. And they just made a siege on the city, and they were able to take the city. And here what happened was that on paper, the Iraqi military had 36,000 people that were stationed there. But most of those people were paying a bribe to get a military paycheck, but were not actually military men, or were on vacation, or did not show up to work, and all of those things. So it was a system of corruption for those people to be able to benefit, which actually led to, in the end, a fall of a pretty important location within Iraq, to a terrorist organization. So not incredibly fortunate. So this, by the way, within the military, it is a very prominent phenomenon. It's called ghost militaries, because the military is especially prone to corruption because it's secretive, right? There is not so much scrutiny or public scrutiny on the military because of the secrecy of the necessitated secrecy. So they're not telling you all of the units, they're not telling the broad public where those units are situated because of security reasons. So it is harder for them to have checks and balances. The checks and balances are kind of only internal, but again, if it's like a whole system of corruption, it becomes problematic. And it can lead to situations that are obviously devastating, such as the fall of Mosul. The preconditions for bottom-up corruption is actually for the system to allow it. So bottom-up corruption would not work if there is a strong government integrity, if workers from the government, officials, political officials from the government, or within companies even, had strong integrity, had a lot of checks and balances. So bottom-up corruption actually follows top-down corruption, but I think top-down corruption I want to talk about in a little, because bribery is the first thing that shows up when we're talking about corruption. And this is actually a secondary thing to corruption, because there are preconditions to this bribery happening in the first place. And the nuance that I wanted also to point out here before we move on to top-down corruption is that corruption might not look the same for everybody. So the people that are benefiting from this bribery are not a homogeneous or part of the population, or not the whole of the population. Obviously, in countries where there is ethnic divide and there are minorities that get discriminated against, they could be exposed and more vulnerable to this type of corruption. For example, some officials might be able to accept bribes from companies, profit-holding businessmen that are from a certain race or a certain ethnicity within a country, but might not be exposed to take a bribe from somebody else. The same goes if it's the other way around. If you're requiring for a bribe. In Bulgaria, it's much more likely that policemen are trying to take bribes out of our Roma minority, because this is something that they perceived as, I don't know, to a certain extent, it seems easier for them to do so. So they're playing into all of those injustices that this minority has by requiring more of them, by making sure that they have like more barriers than the general population. So it is not the same for everybody. It actually looks probably the worst for the most marginalized group, because they're the ones that cannot benefit from corruption in the same way to like pay a bribe to get access to something, but rather would be punished by being coerced into paying a bribe. Although this logic is a little bit, you need to track it in order to get the full sense of it. Bribes sometimes can be beneficial, it can sometimes be harmful. And this is kind of how minorities can also have a problem with this. Going on to top-down corruption. So we have like extortion, which is practice of obtaining something, especially through money, especially money through force or threats. So what happened in Bulgaria, especially in the 90s, where we were transitioning from socialism/communism to democracy after the fall of the USSR. It was actually a little bit before of the fall of the USSR when Bulgaria transitioned to a democracy. What happened is that the government that came to power was incredibly, although democratically elected, not very based within the rule of law. And so a lot of the mayors that were there at the time were extorting a lot of the businesses for money. For example, they were telling that they need to pay a special tax to the government in order for their operations to continue. Otherwise, they would get cracked down by the police. They would literally say to them that there might be a fire in their facilities if they don't pay this special tax, all of those types of things. So extortion is very popular, especially when the corruption has seeped down through all of the parts of the government where you are actively requesting for money. You have also nepotism, which is like the practice among those with power or influence where they're favoring relatives, friends, associates by giving them jobs. So here I have two different examples, not from Bulgaria. The first one is the Bangladeshi quotas, which you might have heard about. So in Bangladesh, last summer there was a revolution where the government of Sheikh Hasina was taken down. She fled the country to India. And the reason behind this is because there were very wide quotas on governmental work. So, governmental work in Bangladesh, also in other Southeast Asian countries, is one of the more prestigious positions, and it is gotten by like a state exam. But at the same time, you have quotas where you want certain ethnicities from the population to get a certain percentage of the positions that are available within those governmental jobs, which again pay really well and are very prestigious. So what happened in Bangladesh is that there were very wide quotas for people that were affiliated with the revolutionary movement in Bangladesh against Pakistan in the 50s or 60s. And those quotas just before the mass protests sparked, which led to the ousting of Sheikh Hasina, were extended to grandchildren of people that were participating within the revolution against Pakistan. And so those quotas obviously favored a certain bit of the population, although it's not like a personal relative of the prime minister. They favored a certain elite part of the population, a certain ethnicity of the population, by extending them to grandchildren, although it did not necessarily, this is not like at the point where you're extending it to grandchildren, probably the claim that you have of you are giving them reparations for something is very weak. And this is, for example, one example of how quotas, or at least nepotism, can work through quotas, and how it can be very harmful. Or in this instance, it actually sparked, the grounds for taking down a very corrupt government in that case, like Sheikh Hasina. After the revolution happened, we have so much exposure about how she had certain special, it was not necessarily military forces, but police forces that were hunting down opposition journalists and opposition members, putting them in prisons that were not like registered prisons, but underground prisons. Like, you can read about this on the internet. It's actually baffling, the system of influence that can happen when there are not that rigorous checks and balances in place, especially like on the heads of state. But going through the Bangladesh example to Greece, so you might have also heard about the Greece train crash of 2023, which was basically two trains for no reason, no apparent reason at all, were like traveling against each other and then crashed. And there was nobody kind of to be like the planner of the routes to be like, maybe we shouldn't put two trains against each other. There were like the people that were supposed to be on ground, because you have like a checks and balance where you have people on ground tracking those types of things. One of them was not showing up for work because they were late for work. The other one was going to grab a sandwich. So the two people that were supposed to be there were not there at the time where the crash could have been prevented, and more than 200 people died. And why I'm bringing up this example is because the boss of the planning bit about the Greek train like infrastructure was actually a cousin of one of the leaders of the political party. And this cousin actually had no expertise within planning for trains at all, and had been elected for the position 3 months ago. So even if we ignore the bit where the people that were supposed to be there to stop the train crash from happening, we ignore this bit. It was a case of nepotism where a person that was not competent for the position received the position, and in turn, because of that, because they're not competent to estimate maybe trains not going directly towards each other on the same train tracks, this led to the death of over 200 people in 2023. By the way, again, this is one of the other examples of very mass protests that were happening in Greece last year, and we still have perpetual protests in Greece because of that. So all throughout the Balkans, you kind of have those protests towards corruption. Then you have embezzlement, which is like a financial crime involving unlawful appropriation of money. This would be your most basic example of debating where people are telling you, oh, yes, politicians steal just from the funds. That's not how it happens. Legally, it's very hard for politicians to go and steal from the funds. There isn't like a pit of money in the center of parliament. Like the budget isn't something physical. They cannot like grab from it and take from it. What happens in most cases is through the how they govern the budget, and especially this is on local level. So we are talking about mayors, we are talking about governors. They are the ones that kind of have the ability to do this embezzlement of money. So what they do is they allocate projects to businesses that they are close to. For example, literally their cousin is running a business. They give a public procurement project, whether it is about building a highway or it is about building a hospital. They give it to the company that is their cousin's company. They agree on a price. This price is 30% over the actual legitimate price for building this hospital. And then they fudge the numbers on the reports, they fudge the numbers on all of the invoices and steal those 30% with the cousin themselves. This is how you kind of embezzle money. This is the process of embezzlement. Like this is the most popular way in which it is done. And here again, the thing that you need to remember is it actually happens on a local level rather than on a federal level. It's not that often that the federal government or like parliament or anything is allocating government projects or government procurement projects. It is very often either specific ministries are doing them, so ministries as well are a place to do embezzlement, but also local government. And this is why local government elections that have odds are lower civic engagement, so you have less people voting, are actually could be comparatively more important, especially for corruption cases, because you need comparative accountability. This is also why it's so important that anti-corruption parties are not only like on a parliamentary level, but rather on a local level as well, because this is the place where the actual embezzlement of big funds happen. Here I've written any EU funds ever, because that's kind of how it is. I'm going to talk about the checks and balances on EU funds and as to why they don't work in a little bit. But what I wanted to say here is another Bulgarian example. So when they're allocating those types of public procurement projects, what happened is 2 months ago, there was a tape released of 2 Sofian regional mayors. So Sofia is the capital of Bulgaria. We have regional mayors, like it's split up in different parts of the capital, and we have mayors for each of those parts. So there was a tape of 2 of those regional mayors of the anti-corruption party talking about how they embezzle at 20% and not at 40% as the corrupt party before them did, and that is why they are the good guys. And this tape obviously got released and they were sent to prison. Honestly, I haven't followed up on that, what's happening there. I'm assuming that they're not going to get any sentences, or the previous mayors are going to get investigated because of that. Just in Bulgaria, nobody has ever been, one person has been prosecuted for corruption and is in jail for corruption. This person is very questionable whether they actually should be in jail and whether they were a scapegoat, but oh well. There are other places, for example, in Serbia, there are multiple people that have been prosecuted for corruption. Romania is a very good example of around 2014, there was a lot of prosecution of corrupt individuals following a documentary released on the healthcare system of Romania. But again, I'm going to talk about solvency of corruption in a bit, and kind of when it works, when it doesn't work. Point was, another example of corruption here could be just talking about how much they're appropriating funds. I don't know, useful example for words. What I wanted to say now, having mapped out the different types of corruptions with some examples, corruption always often works together. So it is not only for the Greek train crash that you had this nepotism of this incompetent person being put in charge of the logistics of when trains are in certain locations. It was also about people not showing up on time, and they get away with that perpetually. No like disciplinary action is taking towards them, so the person just doesn't care that he's late for work, although like literally people's lives are in his hands. The other person knowing that he is the only person to then keep in check whether the trains are going in the appropriate direction, goes out for lunch, or at least this is like the official story. Again, this is another example of how people within a system of corruption also think that they are invincible and also think that what they're doing is okay because everybody is doing it, right? So corruption always works together. It is not only one case of corruption when there is only bribery. No, it's probably bribery plus extortion, plus there is some nepotism within this municipal district. So it is intertwined, and this is why it's so hard and why I said it's a self-perpetuating cycle. The more corruption happens, the more people think it is something normal, and the more they do it themselves. And again, corruption happens at all levels, so it's not only the heads of government that could be conducting corruption. It is also the clerical workers, that whether they're showing up on time, whether they're reporting the appropriate amount of hours that they're spending at work, whether they are themselves taking bribes, even for small things, whether it's about writing a ticket if you're a policeman, or even reporting corruption if you see it. So it works together and it's self-perpetuating. So preconditions, as I said, for bottom-up corruption, it is always to have a top-down corruption, because that's when people are okay to take a bribe when they are asked to receive a bribe. But for top-down corruption, you have, of course, dividing it into intent and capability. With intent, this is something that is always present. People always want to conduct corruption at all times. I know this might sound a little unintuitive, especially for people that are living in the Netherlands, that are within the West in this sort of sense, that maybe have not interacted with corruption on as many levels as I have did. But this is only because you have been socialized in a way that is a little bit more intertwined with integrity, with ethical conduct. The rules were always hardline. But in many places of the world, this was not the case, where you have normal socialization that is kind of the opposite. Even from a very young age in Bulgaria, people are not let to fail in like school. If you get a bad grade, you can always kind of make up for it. You can always talk to the teacher, persuade the teacher. Again, in very extreme cases, you might give a bribe to the teacher. But even if you're persuading the teacher to give you a better grade just with words, like convincing them, okay, but maybe you're like failing my career down the line. And if they accept that, although this is not like giving them money, it is a sort of corruption because you don't deserve that grade and you get away with it. And if that gets like, if that's the normal way in which you grow up, of course, when you like are working a clerical job for the government, you're not going to think so much about, okay, am I conducting my business with some sort of integrity. Of course, if you're in a situation of need and you know that you can ask for a bribe, and like other people that you work for with have asked for a bribe, this is something that is going to be not that big of a deal. It's not going to be that big of a barrier within your mind to break. And I here want to note that I am not saying that all people are bad, all people are sociopaths, they want to like impoverish other people, they want to crack down on systems of governments in ways that are awful. But it, like corruption, especially the first a couple of times of corruption that you're conducting, happens at your personal worst. Like imagine you are a police officer within a country that does not pay you that well. You have a medical crisis at home, but because there is a corrupt system, maybe you're not getting a very good doctor. Maybe the doctor paid bribes in order for them to obtain their medical degree, and the only way for you to get the good doctor is to pay them a bribe. But again, you live within a country that doesn't pay you that well, or maybe you yourself have to pay a couple of bribes like a month in order to be able to live. Maybe you have bribed some headmasters to put your kids in the good school, so you have already like paid more than you were asked for, but you have this medical emergency, and the only way to solve this medical emergency is to get some extra cash flow. uh, what do you do? Like, and again, if everybody else is doing it, or you work with somebody that has done it before, and it's not that big of a deal, and you're at your personal worst and you're rationalizing it. Okay, maybe it's going to be just one time. This person is a criminal anyways, like they deserve some type of consequence for drinking and driving. I think there is no difference between me asking for a bribe, which is going to impoverish them with like 100 euros, 100 less euros for drinking, and them going through the legal system and then maybe receiving the same fine from the government that is about 100 euros. I think there is no legitimate difference. This is why I'm going to ask for a bribe. And so you're kind of normalizing it. You're at your personal worst, okay? In those cases and in those places, I just want to note this is like people being at their personal worst is not like very unlikely. It actually happens quite a bit. And once you've done it once, you have perpetuated the cycle, you have normalized it for somebody else, but you're also normalizing it for yourself. Maybe you then start doing it for smaller things. Maybe you want a new car. Maybe you want to send your children to get education abroad. So you're normalizing it and normalizing it. And this is how from your personal worst you actually have started conducting corruption is in much bigger scale. And I know it might sound unintuitive that so many people are doing it, but again, this is why I kind of wanted to bring a couple of relevant examples, so you have an idea of this actually happens in so many places of the world. And then capacity. So it's based on two things. The first one is internal oversight. So within the structure that you're working in, whether there are enough checks and balances, whether management cares for what you're doing, they're actively checking your work, they're proactive with trying to put systems of oversight, whether it's going to be checkups with the people below them, whether it's going to be a whistleblower system where you can report people, anonymous reporting, whether you're actually going to go through all of the reports that are being submitted and check all of the dots and t's, whether they're actually written with particular integrity, whether they haven't skipped something. All of those things prevent corruption. And when they don't exist as internal checks and balances, corruption can happen. And then you have external oversight. This is oversight from the population, how much people actually care about corruption. And again, this is the self-perpetuating cycle. The more corruption happens in a country, the less people care about corruption in a country, because it's just like the status quo. You can't do anything about it. Corruption has like this problem of omnipotence, not in the sense that it is a centralized actor and it can do everything, but rather it happens on so many levels that it can overwhelm you, and it is decentralized, so you don't know how to tackle it in one particular manner, because it's multiple different people at multiple different points with multiple different incentives doing it at the same time. And this is why a lot of people kind of give up towards corruption and just accept it as something normal, because it is so hard to tackle with. And then checks and balances and why they don't work. So you would think, okay, but all of those developing countries, let's say that we're talking about the developing world, all of those developing countries, they are receiving some loans or some types of aid packages from the developed world. Even if we're talking about Bulgaria, which is part of the European Union, you have all of those EU funds, but you're still conducting corruption. How does this actually happen? Well, in very many instances, there is very irregular checkups from the international organizations that are providing this type of aid on the developing countries. This is factually correct, because you don't have like people stationed from this international organization / the European Union within every member state that is receiving those types of funds. What you have is local people conducting the checks and balances. And you can already see the problem with this. If it's local people, then you can very easily bribe the local person. And of course, if it happens through a political system of corruption, as it did in Bulgaria for very many years, and currently like the party in power is also one of them, what happens is the person that is doing the checks and balances is a person that is from the party in power that is conducting the corruption. And obviously they're not checking the projects that embezzlements happens from. They're only checking projects like the 2-3 projects that are executed in the country, which are actually up to standard of the European Union, and they then provide a report to the European Union that is saying, well, we are actually doing quite well, we are not embezzling any funds. In Bulgaria, there was a very funny revelation that the person that is checking those projects that are with EU money firstly, of course, is elected by the party in power. If the party in power is correct, what do you do? Is corrupt, what do you do? But also, this person like didn't have any binding system on which project they choose. Rather, they have Google random number generated, and every project is assigned a number, and they can like generate a random number. And if they don't like the number, e.g., they don't like the project that this number is affiliated with because they know corruption is happening there, they can just choose a different number. Like there is no binding system that if this random number popped up, they need to check it. And this is how in Bulgaria perpetually we send really good reports that corruption is not happening, embezzlement is not happening, when indeed it is. And here I just want to note that sometimes it is within the interest of the West or international organizations for this corruption to be perpetuated. So it could be either leverage, because maybe if you're giving money to a particular political party that is in power, you're creating connections with this political party. Like when Bulgaria got accepted within the European Union, and you can read about this online, probably we didn't meet the criteria of the European Union. We also, by the way, are seeing something very similar right now with the attempts of the EU, very aggressive attempts to further expand within, whether it's Albania, it is North Macedonia. Those countries are also not incredibly close to meeting all of the very rigorous regulations that the Union has, but because the Union feels the necessity, whether it is because of security concerns, because of Russia, or certain members of the Union, with the case of Bulgaria, it is Germany that wanted to let in some countries so they have a majority within the European Parliament. They receive also a benefit for external reasons if they have some leverage over those political parties. That is why, like, you can see all of those images of the most most corrupt Bulgarian leader, Boyko Borisov, like kissing Ursula von der Leyen. They're like best friends. Ursula last elections endorsed him. This is a person that has like so much evidence against his corruption that is actually baffling, but the European Union benefits from him, and this is something that they support. It can also be, if you are making those checks and balances within those countries, no funds will go to those countries, and this is why I've typed kind-hearted. You can also assume that the West is super good, but the reason why they want to keep on sending money, for example, if it's about aid relief and not check whether all of the money is going into the correct place, is because they don't want to stop sending the aid relief because they care for it. But I also wanted to put a gut check here on how much the West actually cares about democracy and integrity as a whole. There are very many places of the world where I think it's very questionable whether this actually happens. And I think just ignoring certain geopolitical issues, such as the devastating civil war that is currently happening in Sudan, which has a death toll of so many people. We have a similar situation where genocide is happening, perpetuated by the RSF. But this is not something talked about in Western media, or at least not talked as much about as Ukraine and what's happening in Gaza. So it is really a gut check of the West, and like those types of actors also have their own incentives, and they need to be balanced with those values of democracy, integrity, and all of this. And lastly, on what has actually helped with corruption, if we have those problems that are so deeply intertwined with the system in which we live in, here the gut check is what we are saying in Nepal, in Indonesia, in Peru, where you have massive protests led by Gen Z, which is largely due to the ability for those types of people to connect on social media. ICT, by the way, is communication technologies. This is why I have written proliferation of communication technologies. All of those young people were able to connect on social media, organize on social media, but the catalyst, for example, if we're talking about the protest in Nepal, was that on social media, the children of politicians that are living very wealthy lives were posting about it. And so a lot of the Nepali population, because of social media, was able to see the outcome of corruption, which is you have those Nepo babies, probably with a lot of embezzle funds, living their best lives. And because with social media and this democratization of who can report on what is happening all across the world, this allows for people to know more, so have more checks and balances on their government. So do a violent protest when is necessary, as the case with Nepal that took down the government. And also, to be able to organize. And here, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the upcoming technologies besides communication technologies that are able to centralize people, which is AI and other technologies can also help in practice because it can implement rigorous monitoring mechanisms, identifying patterns. So even if people are very corrupt, even if the population is very corrupt, if you have some competent politicians that actually want to make change and they implement those types of monitoring mechanisms, they can actually capture corruption much more, and then if there are proper consequences. And this is my second bit, which is implementing concrete consequences that are actually you are following up on them. So it is both internally within the organization, whether you're firing people when you are finding out that they have fraudulent misconduct, or it's external consequences, whether you're prosecuting them through the judicial system is something also very important. But again, having a strong integrity culture as opposed to ambivalence, something that you're teaching within schools, that you're perpetuating as a work culture, is something very important. But not all of that can happen. And here I wanted to talk about, you have probably heard about it, that Albania has appointed the first world AI-made minister. And the reason that they did this is because of corruption. So she is a minister of public procurement. The reason that Edu Rama, which is the prime minister of Albania, had for appointing an AI minister is because public procurement cannot be trusted to a human person because they will always steal and misappropriate those funds. And this is why you need AI. In the case of Albania, I don't want to get to it too much, but that's probably not the correct course of action. This AI is not specialized to execute a public procurement position. It was a chatbot before it became a minister, and it is not a particularly safe one. But you can see the direction in which we can go, where technology can be very integrated within society, so we can actually escape this corruption that happens because of flaws in humans. And very quickly, I will go through the case of Ukraine, and then I will give you, I think, a 10 minutes break. So Ukraine, from the fall of the USSR, where they became a republic, to 2014, which was the invasion of Crimea, what happened is that they had one of the largest army within Europe. It was near 1 million soldiers, but in the process of those 20 years to 2014, this army was continuously mismanaged purposefully and not funded enough purposefully. And so in 2014, we had a much smaller army of 130,000 soldiers, where when the invasion of Crimea happened, there were less than 7,000 units that were prepared for battle because of ghost soldiers, as I mentioned, but also because not all units are always prepared for battle. Some of them are semi-prepared, some of them are not currently in service, but this was kind of the army that you had. Not a lot of it was prepared, as opposed to after the fall of the USSR, it was around 1 million. And I here want to step back and explain why this corruption within the Ukrainian army happened. It was because of Russian influence. So in this period, you had a couple of ministers that were very tightly associated with Russia. And obviously, Russia has had very perpetual intentions to invade Ukraine for a while. And one of the ways in which this manifested is the corruption, with the higher goal, which was making the Ukrainian military much weaker, resulted in this. It also looked like sale of equipment for pennies. So basically, Ukraine, after the fall of the USSR, had a lot of the tanks, I think, I don't want to say aircraft carriers. I think they did have aircraft carriers, but they had a lot of very heavy artillery and technology. And what happened is they decided to sell them for so much less than what they cost to be made that it is absurd. And most of it was actually sold back to Russia. And when 2014 happened, and I think also within the current war that is happening in Ukraine, some of this equipment has been used by Russia against Ukraine back. But the thing is, they were sold for pennies with the purposeful intention to make the military weaker, so less prepared for war. So there was severe underfunding and mismanagement happening within this period. 2014 hit. Crimea was occupied and annexed by Russia. And what happened is two things that helped. Like, currently, the Ukrainian army is so much less corrupt, and it is a very fascinating case study where the public opinion changed significantly, where corruption was very evident. It hurt them in a very bad way. And also, there was so much urgency to solve the issue of corruption. They obviously saw that a future invasion might be happening. It is obviously for a lot of Ukrainians, especially in the eastern regions of the country, life and death situation, whether Russia is going to invade and your capacity to defend against Russia. Public opinion against corruption changed significantly. There was much more rigorous culture against this type of corruption. There was much more in how people voted for the government as well, how much they care about corruption. And this is why you also get the meme of Zelensky being elected after being an actor. But it was the case that he ran on an anti-corruption basis and platform that he then later got elected. And you can see how the public opinion changed, where the corruption was the primary consideration of who is going to be in power. But the second bit, and here I want to tie it back to technology, is the utilization of technology. So most of the Ukrainian government is now, partially because of the war, but partially because this is a great way to eradicate corruption, transferred to e-governance. So you have a lot of apps and a lot of different technologies that the government is using in order for everything to happen online and through certain portals that are making sure that corruption, bribery, embezzlement, all of those things cannot happen, can be tracked. So it's much harder. For example, you have digital procurement platforms happening. You have the passport for every citizen, where literally through this app, the DIA app, you can marry, you can report whether Russian troops are in a certain part of the country. So the technology centralizes the system so much, and it also puts the additional oversight over the system, and it also excludes certain capabilities of actors to engage in corrupt conduct. Because again, not only intent needs to be present, but intent is significantly decreased because of the public opinion and how it changed towards corruption, but also the capacity is significantly decreased because of the capabilities of now the technological platforms through which governance is happening. So this is like the fascinating case of Ukraine, where corruption was so high prior to 2014, especially within the military, and now it is basically non-existent because of the urgency of the situation, but also the integration of technology. And here, very quickly, misconception about corruption in debating. Corruption trickles down. This is a lie. Corruption very often does not trickle down. The way in which it manifests is not politicians are embezzling money to build a house. Even if that's the case, like ignoring all of the other manifestation of corruptions that I talk about, they're not building a house within the same country. They're putting the money in offshore accounts in Switzerland or the Seychelles or anywhere else in the world but their own country. Very rarely do they actually spend the money that they have embezzled within the country. Corruption happens only in the global south, where people are uneducated. No, it does not happen only in the global south. Yes, refers to something else. The point is the corruption happens only in the global south is a massive misconception. Again, it happens all around the world. If you're thinking about France, it is Uber illegally lobbying Macron. It is certain corporations like Big Pharma within the US being able to cause an opioid crisis because of corruption. It happens on so many levels in so many developed countries as well. But in developing countries, it is just so perpetuated throughout society. It doesn't happen only on the top level. But the worst part of corruption happens everywhere, and this is something very important to keep in mind. But it is the rigorous system of both integrity and checks and balances that you have a little bit more in the West rather than the global South that prevent corruption from happening. And the third misconception is corruption is only stealing money. It is not. In very many instances, it has so much more wider implication of how society functions, just in general, how people are, thinking about society, how people are thinking about the government, how much they want to vote for the government, just in general, whether they want to participate in elections, what is the type of food that they eat, what is the road on which they drive. It is not only about like money moving from here to there, rather it is about the whole system within which we live. Yeah, and this is kind of all that I wanted to talk about. Now, if you have any questions, I am more than happy to take them. If not, we can take a break for 5 minutes. It's a little more than 5 minutes, sorry. But yeah, thank you for
Yes,
listening.
can I ask a question?
Yep.
My question is about the first misconception. It's the last slide.
Yeah. So about corruption trickles down.
Yes, I just
Mhm.
don't get it at all. Like, I don't have a specific question, but I just don't understand it at all.
Yes, no, that's okay. So in debating very often, when somebody runs an argument about corruption, one of the lines of rebuttal that you hear is that corruption is not that bad because it trickles down. So a corrupt politician which steals money is not the worst thing in the world, given that with this money they're probably building a house, and this building of a house employs a certain amount of people within the country, pays for like the cement of the house building. And the reason why this is a lie and the corruption doesn't actually trickle down to people's pockets, although this intuition might make it seem so, is again when people are embezzling money, which is like one of the ways in which corruption can manifest. That's not the most prominent way in which corruption manifests, is that they're taking the money out of the country afterwards. So they're not actually building a house within the country, rather they're just putting them in offshore accounts, or they're buying very nice houses within Spain, which is like what Bulgarian politicians love to do. So this is why I have written down corruption trickle down is a lie, because in debating you are going to hear it, but it is a lie.
Okay, thank you so much.
No worries.
So we're taking a break.
Yeah, we can take a break if there are no more questions.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yep.
If no one else has, because you say, I think, I also missed a large part of your session, so sorry for that. But I also have a little bit of trouble with running corruption case insofar as the direct impacts of this are relatively clear, as in people are directly harmed by if something goes wrong due to corruption. But I think you also point out that there's a lot of wider effects of corruption. For example, like specifically, I think about trusting government being a very important one. I always have a little bit of trouble impacting that one. How would you approach that?
This is always hard to impact, and the reason why it's hard to impact is because corruption might be one of the reasons why people are mistrusting the government, and not all of the reasons. And it's not about one person mistrusting the government, but it is about a larger mass of society mistrusting the government. So already it's hard to impact because you need to explain why corruption is one of the leading factors of people mistrusting the government, why majority of people, or at least a very big mass of people, is going to mistrust the government as a consequence. So not only like one person, but a lot of them. And this makes it a little bit hard. And then the consequence of them mistrusting the government also might seem very wishy-washy, because okay, less people vote, so what? Less people go out to protest, so what? But again, debating in this sense kind of is not the same as the real world, because in the real world, over a 10-year course of time, this has massive impacts. For example, what happened in Bulgaria is you had an election turnout rate of 60% in the beginning of COVID. So during COVID, we had massive protests about our corrupt government that was in power for 12 years. There was a lot of revelation around the corrupt government. So there was a lot of investigative journalism that revealed that, you know, our most corrupt leader, again, the prime minister for so many years, had so much cash, like stacks of cash at his home, gold blocks, guns. Like you could see photos all around the media. So many people went out to protest. They were able to take down the government. The government was voted no confidence. And then what happened was we had a perpetual election cycle where we couldn't find a party to elect that was not corrupt. And this went on for like 2 years, where we were having an election after election after election, where from 2020 to 2022, we just couldn't find a party that was able to replace this old model. So what happened is the corruption of those 12 years of politics had actually entrenched to all of the parties. In 2020, it was the end of 2021, a new party emerged, which was an anti-corruption party, completely new. All of the people were businessmen, graduated from Harvard or other Western universities, and majority, not majority, but like 30% of the population voted for this party. They won mandate. They got elected. What happened was they weren't able to tackle corruption because, again, corruption is so incredibly hard to tackle. All of the local government executes the corruption. It is not the federal government. So they actually not only need to stay in power, to have some new laws to prevent corruption. Rather, they need the cooperation of the local government. The local government was still held by the corrupt parties. And yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just accidentally opened it.
Yeah, no worries. I was wondering whether it is a question or not. Yeah. So what happened is, again, the local government did not cooperate with them. It actually cut off in very many places of the country contact with the main party. And here is where the problem came, where this party that had run on anti-corruption after 2 years of perpetual elections that we weren't able to elect a party, people just started losing faith. So we not only had to go through all of those election cycles, we also elected a party that was utterly incompetent in eradicated corruption, which ended up being the case. And from 60% election turnout, the current election turnout that we have is just around 30%, which led to the corrupt party that we ousted in 2020 coming back to power, doing all of those things now. So even though it's a little bit hard to impact because it's not so concrete, you cannot say with 100% certainty the corrupt party is coming back. In very many places of the world, with 10 years of period of time, it is the case where there is eradication of trust. It is so complex to tackle corruption that in the end, it's going to get back to being a system of corruption. And I think you can either try to explain that and to be a little bit realistic and to be like, yes, I know it's not like something that you can touch, but over 10 years, it actually has much a wider and bigger impact. So trying to scale it in a way, or the other way is this mistrust of people actually makes corruption so prominent in all other like places of society. Like, I think it's baffling that in order for you to get a good doctor's appointment, you need to pay a bribe. Like, this is something that happens because of the mistrust towards the government and because of lack of oversight. So having like 5 examples that are maybe nothing related directly to the government of how corruption can manifest in like day-to-day life to people because there is so much mistrust towards the government is maybe another way to go at it. Because like having to pay for a bribe for your doctor's appointment, this is something that the judge can touch and be like, yeah, that's a concrete impact.